In our study of the life divine, we are reading the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man, in which Sri Aurobindo is describing the means by which the spiritual being emerges out of the mental being. This is part of a larger discussion where Sri Aurobindo has described in the previous chapter, the stages through which the mental being emerged in evolution and the difficulties it had to face. And the pattern we saw there is broadly repeated not only in earlier stages of evolution, but in the immediate current stage of evolution, where the spiritual consciousness is emerging out of mind, but not just as a consciousness, but as a conscious being. Just as mind is not merely a state of consciousness, but eventually emerges as a conscious being in an individually formed, developed, organized individuality. So the spiritual being emerges out of this mental being that we are and must face its own peculiar difficulties in this emergence, which Sri Aurobindo maps out in great detail, showing us also how to navigate through and around those difficulties. First of all, he says, we need to see what nature has done in this emergence and what processes she has already initiated, how far they have come. And then only we can pick up from where nature leaves and build upon it, so to say, accelerating nature's own effort by our participation. But we cannot do that effectively if we do not first recognize the movement which nature has initiated and where it has brought us to. And this insight which he gives us is something so extraordinary. He gives you a sweep of not only the stages of human development in the past, let's say, a few thousand years, in which nature has been preparing this, but then highlights the point of crisis that we are at, and we understand it in terms of what nature is doing. First of all, he points out that nature uses 4 broad lines by which she makes the human mental being awaken to the inner, deeper spiritual realities. And through that awakening, that can now emerge and eventually take its own form. In this, he lists the 4 broad lines. First, as religion. Second, occultism. Third, the spiritual philosophy. And fourth is the direct experience of inner spiritual realities. Religion plays a critical role in assisting the outer part of the personality to prepare for the direct experience. And its special contribution in this fourfold awakening is to put us in relation with the divine as a being, God, or any aspects of the divine, gods, or any intermediate divine or spiritual beings or embodiments. And as a relationship that we develop, we acquire a rich experience of all the facets and aspects of the divine in the manifestation. This is the special work of religion. Occultism awakens us to our own inner powers. We are no more this little thinking mind and body with a little bit of vital energy. We are much more in the inner mind and inner vital and even in the inner physical, which open out to infinity, even connect to the whole universe. And there are powers within us which are powers of infinity, which are still preparing to fully emerge in our more surface mental and even physical parts. And occultism opens us to our own inner greater potential, which then allows us to participate in the divine manifestation with the full play of the divine powers latent within us. The spiritual philosophy, which is the third stream of development, prepares in particular our mind to an understanding of what's happening, an understanding of what the divine working is in the universe, and why and how the divine unfolds or manifests in all these different ways. Without that, the mind would not be able to participate, because it would not be able to understand, and therefore would not be able to join in and work with this whole emergent process of spiritual evolution. And finally, all these three really prepare us for a more direct experience of the spirit. But that experience, if it is not sufficiently supported by a deeper understanding, we can misunderstand the experience, prematurely consider ourselves as having reached some goal, or give a false value to something which is otherwise quite different. If it is not supported by the occult dimension, the experience might fall short. I experience an exaltation, I feel my body light, my mind awakens to a illumination, and that's it. That's all I can do, because my inner realms, where the real descent, where the real awakening has to take place, are still concealed and hidden, not bridged with my outer parts. And so there's a limitation which comes with however beautiful the experience might be. And if there is not sufficiently the base that religion has provided, the experience may still remain as a realm of abstraction or as some higher state, but not linked to the conscious individual who is evolving and growing towards divinity. So what we see in Sri Aurobindo's very detailed presentation of these four aspects is that each of these lines supports and nourishes the other three, leading to a full development. We must recognize that what we are reading here and studying is not only applicable for humanity as a whole, but it is equally applicable to every collective within humanity, which would include here communities such as ours, but even small collectives, centers, or any collective which is not physically located. It might be a community today through the internet of like-minded people sharing things on a mailing group of some kind. It is equally applicable to cultures and civilizations and nations, and it is equally applicable to each one of us individually. In each one of us, these four lines of development have to grow, and in each of these four lines, all the difficulties he describes and the means around them which he maps out are applicable to us. For some of us, more of one, less of another, and even that which we think is less, eventually we have to face that difficulty in some form or other. Next, in a very essential paragraph, he describes the process of nature as she works everywhere in creation, in emergence of anything higher out of a lower thing. And all evolution, he says, has to proceed at first by a slow unfolding. He describes broadly three stages of this unfolding and many finer sub-stages. First, when it is emerging out of this obscurity of the original medium, there are the pulls and strains, and what emerges at first is only a vague urge and tendency, often submerged, subliminal. And then only gradually it comes into some recognizable formation, but always crude and coarse in the beginning. And religions have gone through this, as occultism, as everything else. In the second stage, the formations, now small or large, begin to come into their own, but they're still not fully vivid and intense. And when they grow sufficiently, there is even a reversal, where now the new thing emergent is able to stand on its own and even look down at the earlier material and life of earlier stages. And with this reversal, there is the possibility of a radical change, and still a long growth is waiting. That's only second stage. The third stage is when the thing which has emerged is now to be confirmed, to be fixed, and to be saved from, he uses the word, secured against relapse into the old stage. Now, we are at this transition point in the development of the human mind. You can see everywhere, in every individual, the mind has sufficiently come into its own. You can say, yes, this person is thinking and intelligent. And the few who do not have that ability, we say, are stunted in their growth. They are retarded. It's not normal. It's abnormal. And yet, this part of the mind which has emerged, we can recognize, is not entirely secured against relapse. And we do see in large parts of humanity the tendency of the intellect to relapse. And it is a serious difficulty which makes for a kind of a tendency towards barbarism in what is otherwise a very sophisticated and modern society. But the values expressed are still barbaric. So this third phase really brings that new power into its own, and this, he says, the power itself must open to its full range of possibilities, reach its utmost height, subtlety, richness and wideness, until it dominates and embraces everything, comprehends everything, and even changes everything into its terms. This has not yet happened with the human mind in large parts of humanity. But it has sufficiently happened in small parts of humanity that humanity can now hope to move forward into a spiritual age. And for this, Sri Aurobindo now, in this whole passage, in this transition, Sri Aurobindo takes up each of these four, describing how these four have worked, what they have contributed, what their limitations are, and what is their fulfillment. He began with the religion. Obviously, in its first beginnings, it has to be crude with mixtures. There are mixes of the vital and the mental preconceptions, desires, and so on. And so the journey of religion has been checkered. Blacks and whites, inevitably. And we saw the sense of checkered. You cannot get from one white square to the next white square without passing through a black square. In the sense that you cannot grow further without having something come in the way, some limitation. And that has been the journey of religion. But then he points out, and this is the portion we read last time, we are only summarizing so far. Religion opened itself to denial by its claim to determine the truth by divine authority, by inspiration, infallible sovereignty. It tried to impose itself on human thought. And Sri Aurobindo explains that it is a premature claim. It has not yet reached the stage of consciousness where it can be infallible, and that is only in the supramental. And the claim was excessive. But it was necessary even, or unavoidable, because of the nature of the experience of the spirit. You receive an intuition, you receive an inspiration, and it is so overwhelming, so compelling, so true, that you cannot but say, this is it, this is right. And even if it contradicts reason or facts, something in you feels the truth of this. Even that this kind of an inspiration or the faith which backs it is indispensable, because we could not proceed forward, he says, in the journey through the unknown. The error, though, is when it has imposed itself. And rather, it should have been a free perception or an imperative direction from the inner spirit. And only when it comes in that way, you can say, yes, this is what I will follow. But what religion did was, it took something which was somebody's inner directive, somebody's imperative or free perception, and said, now all of you have to do this. And there it went off track. So we see here that in the religious tendency, in the religious turn, if we had allowed for each individual to follow that deeper awakening and the line of that deeper influence, then it might not have gone into this error. So in the very act of mapping out the errors of religion, he's showing you also the corrections. And we will see in the next paragraph, which we will take up today, how that could have been implemented, and in fact has been implemented in one of the spaces on the earth. But the unquestioned acceptance, he says, can only come when the supramental truth has been established, free from all ignorant mixture. And this is the ultimate object before us. So now I continue the text, 2 more lines which remained in this paragraph. This is the ultimate object before us. That is the supramental realization, which can come as the highest truth consciousness, error-free. But it has not yet been accomplished, and the premature claim has obscured the true work of the religious instinct in man, which is, and now he lists all the things which the religious instinct has to accomplish and which is its true work. In the very formulation, we have to pause at some of these very important words. He speaks of the true work of the religious instinct in man, suggesting that it is part of the instinct of the human, the very nature of our humanity. Now, what is instinct? When you say the bird instinctively picks up a twig, instinctively makes a nest, instinctively goes in the morning to pick up the worm when the worms are most likely to be on the surface. What is this instinct? It is a precise and true knowledge. Where does it come from? It is the impulse that nature has hidden inside every creature. Instinct is a very precise knowledge and will combined. But the nature of instinct is that the will dominates the knowledge. The knowledge is concealed. You do not see what the will is leading you to until the work is done. Until the nest is completed, you don't know what the bird was trying to do. Until it has laid its egg, you do not know why it was building a nest. Until the egg hatches, also by instinct, you do not know what the egg was all about. So the knowledge is always hidden and seen only after the will of the instinct has completed its work. And this is what happens within the human being. Inside us is this religious instinct. You cannot suppress it. You cannot erase it because it's so deeply embedded by nature. So you will see everywhere, wherever there have been attempts to suppress the religious instinct, it seems to work for a while because it is covered by some other power which is exaggerated. For example, reason, logic, science, as they will say. But eventually, you will find the religious instinct worms its way and uses the intellect even to fulfill itself. Einstein's great declaration, when he was struggling with some of the peculiarities of quantum physics, he said, I cannot accept that God will play dice with the universe. And there comes the religious instinct. Even if he didn't use the word God, his basis for accepting something was that religious instinct. Does it fit this? And if it doesn't, something is wrong. If it does, I can accept that it is true. You may not use the word and the vocabulary of religion, and yet the instinct will guide even the journey of science. One of the big difficulties of modern science is this whole idea of a Big Bang. And not many realize that it is not a scientific idea. Because in the very idea of a Big Bang where suddenly the universe begins, there is a time before the beginning of the universe. And yet in that time there is no time because time begins with the universe. It is inherently a self-contradictory idea. It presumes something possible which is timeless and spaceless and with the power to create space and time. And somewhere in time it begins. The very vocabulary of Big Bang is contradictory to the concept. But how did it come? Because the scientists were so deeply steeped in the earlier religious formulation which came with the biblical teaching that God said, let there be light, and the universe was born. And so this idea was so deeply rooted that a reality which didn't fit and heavy mixture of religious instinct that somehow God has to initiate was inherent in the very thinking of science which had rejected God and religion. And so somewhere it has to start. And of course the facts always tend to contradict. Every now and then you'll see evidence that the universe is older than we thought. We see galaxies which are so old, almost at the time the universe began, and yet they appear to be completely mature and formed galaxies, and we can't explain. This push, the sense that there is something beyond which makes the whole universe meaningful, is the very nature of that religious instinct. And so you will see in Soviet Union, when the religion was formally abolished, you still had the truth of religion coming out in mystical forms. I remember in those years, the cinema that came from the Soviet Union was the most mystical cinema, more than anything you got anywhere else in the world. And it is that truth, the sense of something deeper behind appearances, which worked. In the explorations of parapsychological phenomena, the Soviet Union was the most advanced in the world. It could accept and recognize the truth of these occult powers precisely because it had safely considered itself free from religious error. And so now it can freely explore things which are evidenced by the very fact that they exist. But eventually you see the reversal. After 3 generations of that suppression, suddenly the entire structure, superstructure, collapses, and the religious impulse comes forward, liberated and sometimes even exaggerated in its quest, thirsting now for something which it has denied itself for so long. So in his very use of this word, religious instinct in man is this fact that you cannot avoid it. Rather, recognize it and channel it in a healthy way. And what will be its healthy use? What is its real purpose? And this he lists here. It has obscured, all this premature claim has obscured the true work of the religious instinct in man, which is, first, to lead him towards the divine reality. Second, to formulate all that he has yet achieved in that direction. And third, to give to each human being a mold of spiritual discipline, a way of seeking, touching, nearing the divine truth, a way which is proper to the potentialities of his nature. So let's look at each of these, because the third has multiple aspects within it. But the first, which is the most broad formulation, is lead him towards the divine reality. D capital, R capital, divine reality. It's not D lowercase reality capital. The reality is divine, is the divine. You see, if it was D capital, divine, and reality capital, reality is the thing and divine is like an adjective describing, the nature of that reality is divine. But when he says divine reality with a D, it means the reality is the divine conscious being. So to lead him towards the divine reality. And I took the example earlier of the Soviet Union and the exploration of the parapsychological phenomena. It came from a perception that there is something behind, which is as if more real, more powerful, even more effective than the appearance of what we are. And to tap into that realm is our birthright, is an even inevitable part of our evolution. But it was pointing towards the divine reality without recognizing that it is the divine. But moving towards that, leading towards the divine reality is the first object of religion. But as a secondary object, therefore, it has to formulate all that he has yet achieved in that direction. So if through all the ages that we have been in this quest, in this forward movement, certain things have been achieved and realized, isn't it important to organize that and to transmit it into the next generation, that our children may grow up with that which is already done and not having to rediscover it all? So in the religious education, you're told, there is a divine reality and there are great sages who have lived in it and experienced it and who have taught us how to get to it. And you start by seeing it. And then you start by giving the knowledge which those sages have taught you. And maybe even share those stories and those experiences of that reality. And so it is as if formulating all that has been achieved in that direction, which leads then to the third aspect of the work. And to give to each human being a mold of spiritual discipline a way which is proper to the potentialities of his nature, and then many things in between. So, a mold of spiritual discipline to each human being, and recognizing that it may vary from person to person. But if you do not have that mold of a spiritual discipline, very likely the benefits, the gains of all the struggles of the past might be lost in a moment's stupidity. For example, it is very strongly advised in spiritual traditions not to take drugs. Why? Because sometimes a single exposure to some of these very powerful drugs can damage you on a psychological level or even a biological level, at the level of your nervous system, in a way that will prevent your full spiritual development in a healthy body. I know of people in their 50s now or 60s who speak of how, we did those weed and other drugs which were smoked in our youth because it was fashionable then, but even now I can feel that it has affected my memory. If it can affect your memory, of course it can affect many more things, but it can also do other things. For example, if at that point you're prematurely exposed to something of the vital world and you are exposed in a way that you're unable to protect yourself, which is the nature of the drugs, it forces the barriers to fall by force. You allow an invasion of some external impulse, beings or forces, which can now come in freely because you don't have the instinctive protection, which happens when you sleep. You see, you have a nightmare in sleep, something attacks you, instantly you pull back, you wake up, you're in protection. But because of the state of the drugs, that protection is held back for whatever duration the drugs last, minutes, hours, days. Those beings have free access to you, can then enter you, seize something in you, twist something in you, hook themselves in you, lodge themselves in you, and stay permanently inside you as an impulse now which becomes a part of your personality, which you fight for the rest of your life. Dangerous. Or a gap is created in your aura, which then prevents you from containing a deep spiritual presence and power that would otherwise fill you as a healthy container, now leaking out through the aura. And I give this as an extreme example, but there are other things also which could similarly harm. One, for example, is certain instinctive tendencies which often shape our personality. If sustained long enough, could become a part of your character. And if it is contrary to the spiritual discipline, can warp or greatly delay your spiritual development. For example, a strong impulse of greed, strong, coarse anger. And if permitted or encouraged at an early stage, if not sufficiently contained and channeled positively, would lead to a personality which, when in a high spiritual afflatus, would burst out in anger and spill the spiritual power, but also create great destruction. And we know stories of rishis who had that problem of anger, and they would curse on a whim and then regret that they had cursed. But now it's too late. The energy is released. You can only redirect it. You cannot prevent it or reverse it. And many such. The discipline, spiritual discipline, has a positive side. If from the beginning you are taught to start viewing things from an inner perspective, that within every being, within every object is the divine presence. As a discipline, it prepares your mind and opens your heart to the direct touch and experience of the divine. If from the beginning you are taught that this universe is not an accident, that you are here by choice, that there is a divine purpose, that there is divine presence, the divine help, the divine grace and the divine love with you all the time, even if you don't feel it. It shapes your thinking, it shapes your drives, it frees you from so many fears and other distortions. And so the spiritual discipline and the mold of the spiritual discipline is extremely valuable if you want really this spiritual evolution to accelerate. Not only for yourself individually, but in the collective, in society, in humanity. Today perhaps we have the very opposite values which are being inculcated through a lot of the cinema. And the parents who would normally have protected you from those values are not present. They're too busy earning their living. And that's why we see a decline of those spiritual values equally. And this is why the importance Sri Aurobindo makes earlier of the securing against relapse and downward gravitation, because it happens in any evolution of a civilization, that there will be cycles of rise and then cycles of decline before there can be another rise. And can you protect against the loss in the declining phase, or will it entirely relapse to begin all over again? And so the securing is so important. There's a very interesting observation Sri Aurobindo makes, and this is with regard to India in particular. He says that the divine working, and he refers to how it was in Aripur jail that he had these revelations. He said the divine Sri Krishna showed him how in India the sattvic aspect has been developed even to an exaggeration, even seeming as if to weaken the civilization, allowing invasions because of the sattvic aspect. But for a reason, he says, so that eventually when the rajas and the rajasic aspect is regained, it will not fall into the error of the rajas seizing and taking charge, which is often the problem. You specialize in one aspect in order to prepare something and then try to integrate with something else, and you lose, especially if it's something more refined. The course, the drive of rajas can easily overwhelm the sattvic. So it's as if the whole thing has got delayed because of that, and a whole series of problems have come from that unbalanced sattvic tendency, which very easily slides into tamas and inertia. But otherwise, when it is there, can be a clarity and illumination of a kind. But now the rajasic tendency, the vitality and force and dynamism have to awaken, but under the influence of the balance of sattva. And it takes a little longer, but it has a purpose. There is a rationale to it. And so all of this is to show that the mold of the discipline is so valuable. If sufficiently established, it can even protect from the decline and the fall, or a resurgence of some contrary tendency, which will also happen, can then be contained if the mold is strong. And so religion tries to capture, hold, cling to, establish that mold in the people. Sri Aurobindo points to another interesting example. In Europe, the religious training and one of the molds which it brought was this discipline and the collective discipline and the meticulous, disciplined pursuit of the religious teaching and life as taught by the church, imposed and drilled in for so long that it became part of the people and the collective consciousness, that when the religion was overthrown and science and reason took over, it retained still that collective discipline and the pursuit and quest of the truth with a disciplined mind now, which in fact was drilled in by the earlier religious passage of training. And where that was not so strong, you find the emergence is not so disciplined, as you will see in India. And it has a very different path, a very different approach to take, much more fluid and much more complex. And he will speak of this shortly in the next paragraph. So, the object of religion is, he says, to lead humanity towards the divine reality, to formulate all that has yet been achieved in that direction, and to give to each human being a mold of spiritual discipline. The problem, though, of religion is that it creates a one mold for all. And there again it becomes an imposition rather than allowing each one to follow their innate tendency. And of course, in practice, it means religions split. So different collectives on whom the mold doesn't fit break away and create their own variant on the religion. Within those, again, another variant. So if you just take the example of what started as a monolith of the church in Europe and parts of the world subsequently, is today, I was given some extraordinary statistic of several thousand very specialized sects within the Christian tradition, of which broadly they can be described as 300 groupings. And it would make sense. Swami Vivekananda points out how religion inherently tends to split because it is trying to impose one flat, uniform approach across a diversity. And the fulfillment of religion, when it continues to split until you have one religion for each person. And at that point, it becomes spirituality. It's a way of looking at that passage. To give to each human being a mold of spiritual discipline, but the aspect is the fact of discipline. And not just discipline, a way of seeking. What is this discipline doing? It's showing you how to seek. If it tells you from the beginning, in each thing there is the divine presence, but you cannot feel it unless you become very quiet. And the divine presence is felt as something very still and quiet. And you have to become quiet to feel it. So a way is taught. You can do this prayer. You can repeat this. Use this formula. Use this ritual. Wake up every morning when you're most fresh. Remember the divine. Follow this. Whatever that means. It's a way of seeking. And then he uses now 3 words. Seeking, touching, nearing the divine truth. So at first you might think, why touching and then nearing? You must near first before you can touch, isn't it? Because that which you're seeking is not a form and an object. So first when you touch the presence. And then you go deeper into the presence. You near the core of the presence. Because inherently it is formless. The touching is first. And then the nearing to the core of it, in its purity, in its intensity, in its infinity and eternity, that is the nearing the divine truth and the oneness. So, a way of seeking, touching, nearing the divine truth. A way which is proper to the potentialities of his nature. Now, what's the point of this? In each one of us, there is a potentiality, some aspect, some tendency, some need, some power waiting to emerge. And according to that which is emerging is your way. And if for someone it is through the love of the heart, well, that should be the mold and that should be the way for you. If someone else it is through the mind and the understanding, that will be the mold. If for someone it is the work and action and the will dedicated to a cause, well, that is his way. So proper to the potentialities of his nature, depending on which aspect and which potential is emerging, your religious form must catch that and assist that emergence. And now we come to this very interesting example, having seen how the claim of imposition of religion has actually covered up, obscured this true work of religion. He shows there could be a different way for religion to grow. This is the next paragraph. The wide and supple method of evolutionary nature, providing the amplest scope and preserving the true intention of the religious seeking of the human being, can be recognized in the development of religion in India, where any number of religious formulations, cults, and disciplines have been allowed, even encouraged to subsist side by side. And each man was free to accept and follow that which was congenial to his thought, feeling, temperament, build of the nature. So this he gives as an example of nature's wide and supple method, which provides for the amplest scope and preserves the true intention of the religious seeking in the human being. And this can be recognized in the development of religion in India. Doesn't mean it was not there everywhere else. It was there everywhere. But in India, what you see is in one relatively small patch of humanity, you can see the full play of this. If you want to see it in the rest of humanity, you have to kind of broaden the perspective across time and across space. And then you will see in different cultures, civilizations, nations, broad streams, and then within that, breaks and joins and rejoining and re-breaking and rejoining, each time as if allowing for this free play to develop. And wherever human beings have put the resistance, nature as if works around it, takes a little longer, but eventually finds this way. But we look at India now as a space and see what actually was done. So this wide and supple method of evolutionary nature, it can be imaged most beautifully if you see a rainforest. You see large trees, you see many plants. Every height, every layer has its own life patterns, and even we will say a layer of life which lives on that domain, building multiple domains at different heights. And wherever there's a crack, something grows eventually. And along with these fixed trees are the vines, the creepers, and the rich mix of the roots and the branches joining, embracing each other. It was, when you see the whole forest, you see this complex mesh. And when it spans across a hill, you see the roots inside joining all the trees as if touching each other, embracing each other, connecting like a complex network, like brain cells. And each is communicating with everyone else. And the evidence today is not only that they communicate, they even exchange nutrition. One tree creates nutrition or accumulates nutrition and passes on to others, even of other species. And it's a beautiful example of how nature works, except that it is more fixed because that's the nature of plants. And in human beings, it is much more fluid and moving. So this wide and supple method of evolutionary nature, she is always doing this everywhere. And then if you can scale this to the universe and consider that every planet has its own life and evolution, and you get a real sense of how vast nature's working is. And Earth is just one tiny pocket and a special focus, providing the amplest scope and preserving the true intention of the religious seeking, because at every step it allowed for the free working of this true impulse. And what happens in India? Any number of religious formulations, cults, and disciplines have been allowed, even encouraged to subsist side by side. So religious formulations, cults, and disciplines. And they represent three very different kinds of forms. And you'll see how it matches with what he described earlier. Remember, earlier he spoke of the purpose of religion as lead towards the divine, formulate what has been achieved in that direction, and give a spiritual discipline. Three things. You'll find this happening here. Religious formulations, which broadly give you that direction. Cults, which have the tendency to want to preserve a particular experience developed. And third, disciplines and practices. Yoga and certain specialized paths of yoga being some of them. They are practices without an obvious religious or cult component. So you can easily separate them and call them very scientific and kind of secularize them, but of course they lose their deeper purpose in the process. So let's look at each of these. Religious formulations. We have, interestingly, broad formulations traditionally described as being 6 different darshana. Darshana, as darshan, which we see here, is the vision, the revelation would be a better translation. Revelations of divine reality. And they're broadly described as being 6. We have also texts, more ancient ones, which describe them as being 10 or 12 or more. But over time, they have as if coagulated into 6 broad approaches. And they're given specific names. But it is also taught that each of these 6 is one way of approaching or looking at the reality. When you actually experience the reality, you realize all 6 are specialized facets of each other. Sri Aurobindo interestingly articulates each of these and describes the truth of each of these. Well, for one of them, for example, will say that the divine is one with the whole universe and the world, and we are always in our essence one with the divine. But another would say, no, that's not true. We can approach the divine, but we can never merge with the divine because we are inherently separate in the very act of being a soul. And we can approach and experience immersion, but we will always remain separate. And that's a way of looking at it. And Sri Aurobindo shows you the validity of even that experience. There are approaches which look at the whole universe in terms of reduction to measurements and numbers. That is the Sankhya approach, which is closest to modern science. And then there is the yoga, which is not analytic like Sankhya, but unifying and joining, which looks at things in continuities and wholes. And so there are broadly 6 in these. And I found that number to be always interesting because it suggests some relationships in the geometry. When you look at Sri Aurobindo's symbol, you have the 6 triangles, and there's a rationale to that whole thing, that the self expresses in 6 distinct aspects. The 7th being the self itself as it knows itself, unifying all 6, a way of looking. And in the integral yoga, Sri Aurobindo does precisely that. He shows you the justification of each of these aspects. And so these would be described as darshanas. We can view them as religious formulations, which then take each of these and make specialized formulations. Sikhism, which is celebrating today 550 years, I believe, of its foundation, is one such. And it's fascinating in the way it emerged. It came at a time when Hinduism had been so weakened by the invasions and its own inherent weaknesses and exaggerated sattvic tendencies, that it had lost the power to defend itself. And there was danger of losing something very precious. And here comes a special vibhuti, incarnation of the divine. And the first Sikh Guru actually describes how he was meditating in the Himalayas in a particular lake, Hemkund Lake, and he was given the assignment to incarnate to save the truth of the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal tradition, the spiritual tradition. So he leaves his body there, incarnates in this form in a milieu of great social and political unrest and collision of contradictory values. And Sri Aurobindo describes what he developed as the first attempt of Hinduism to absorb the principles or the truth of Islam and to integrate that into it, and which is the truth of force and exclusive obedience to the divine. And this is the special character of the Islamic consciousness. And so that element had to be absorbed as if. And so what he does, he goes to every household and says, "Give me your eldest son." And each of these now become his followers. Sikhism became effectively the strong arm of awakening, integrating the spiritual with the aspect of power and strength in action, in utter servitude to the divine. And so the symbol of Sikhism is the sword, and then around it, this half circle, which represents the spiritual aspect. And each of his disciples was made to swear an oath of complete obedience to the divine will, with nothing of your individual personal will to come in the way. And that's how it began. Obviously, Sri Aurobindo points out, it was also premature in the sense that humanity was not really ready for a full spiritual awakening, and so it tended to reduce itself into religious forms. The formulation of how do you ensure that you do not get swayed by your personal will? Well, protect yourself by doing these, going out, helping others, never refusing a call for help, always being in service, always obeying the authority. It took many forms, which also can be misused by structures of religion, religious organization. But what it did was build this very strong, highly spiritual core, which knew how to wield strength and power. And so this is just one example of how something can emerge, and it's a religious formulation. And then there are cults, often within a single religion, specialized cults, where the nature of the cult is it takes an individual or an aspect of the teaching and exalts it above all else. The goal being, of course, to hold and contain that special feature, which is almost unique to that cult or that lineage. And at that point, it's trying to do this, to formulate all that he has yet achieved in that direction, but to move it to the point of becoming a spiritual discipline. That's the second aspect of the religious working. And then come the disciplines which have to be followed. And the interesting thing about disciplines is sometimes they're so free of particular form, they float around, they are taught, and they go around. Waking up early every morning and doing your prayers is one of the forms of discipline, so valuable, so useful, that you'll find it present practically in all traditions. And even if those who are not religious want to do something worthwhile in life, that's the time when your mind is most fresh and you can do the most inspirational work of creative writing or developing your skill of art or music. So it's a kind of discipline which becomes almost universal. Other disciplines, such as making daily an offering, tithing. Tithing is one form in which you say, whatever I earn, every time I get money, I will set aside 5% or 10% for that, whatever that means for you, for the divine, for society, for my community, whatever form it may be. But the very fact that you give away, the moment you receive, you separate a percentage to offer to something which is greater than you, is a discipline. A discipline which reminds you that you're a part of a whole, all the way to the divine, but any intermediate whole to which you owe gratitude, allegiance, service, whatever form that tradition may be. The other practices, disciplines, every day you sit down, read something. Every day you do some action. Mother suggests, for example, one of the disciplines, every day you should do one thing that you don't like to do. Spend 1 hour every day in service entirely of others, where you gain nothing. Now, these are disciplines, and you can see the value. And especially if the goal is a spiritual development, these are all useful. If you ever want to take up a body of disciplines like this, you take this little booklet. There are a series of 5 talks of the Mother, which is called The 4 Austerities and the 4 Liberations. The disciplines which are for the austerity of knowledge, the austerity of love, the austerity of beauty, the austerity of power, and the disciplines associated with each. Read the whole thing, and everything is so practical. Most of it is too difficult to do. But start with the small 5%, I say always, 5%, which is easy to do and which you feel particularly inspired to follow. Now, for the discipline of knowledge, she says, one of the things to do is never speak a lie. If you want to be able to receive the truth and recognize the truth without distortion, your mind should be used to being true. If it has the habit of lying, then even when the spiritual truth comes in, it gets warped by your lying tendency, which is a warping tendency in the receiving medium of your mind. Now, for some people, this will be, wow, with this training, I can actually receive the pure inspiration and truth and be able to transmit it without distortion. For some people, it will be something fascinating. I must start. For someone else, it may be, especially for them, the turn is more towards the aspect of power. I can't live life without lying. Okay, I will reduce my lying. I'll speak white lies, but I can't entirely give up lying. Okay, you start with what you can. Start with the little things you can do. But start. And you will see the benefit of those disciplines. So, the point being, any number of religious formulations, cults and disciplines have been allowed, even encouraged, to subsist side by side. How can you encourage that? And it is strange to the Abrahamic traditions that you would encourage different disciplines or religious formulations. Whereas to the Indian mind, it is difficult to understand how you can impose a single formulation or a single discipline on a collective and expect that to work. Because these are two almost contradictory approaches. So when the Abrahamic tradition looks at the Indian space, they say, my God, so many religions. I even had a professor, a very senior professor in an elite university in Europe, who teaches how nations are born out of their religious identity. And then she was discussing her work, and then she looks at me and she said, India is a chaos, so many religions, can't make head or tail of it. Chaos. Because for them, the identity is formed by the religious. And here the identity was never religious. Rather, religion was the way you related to the divine. The identity was something underlying, which was the common love for the divine, or the common sense of an underlying reality which embraces and holds it all together. That became the identifying character and the defining character of the culture, which was a spiritual culture, therefore. So what is interesting is here, the starting idea was that within each one of us is an essential expression of the same truth. The truth is one, it expresses itself uniquely in different ways. It can be formulated in different ways. And in the very act of formulating, that is giving form, you're reducing it and losing its essentiality and true truth. You're warping it. And this is something so fundamentally accepted that obviously each one has his own way. Whereas those in the Abrahamic traditions, which are people of the book, as they describe it, the book is the truth. And now you have to interpret the book and understand every nuance and comma to get to the what was God's word to be followed precisely. So this starting point, recognizing that each one had its own way, allowed for this differentiation. And if someone says, this doesn't gel with me, then the person says, all right, what's your way? How does it work for you? Let's build on that. Let's follow that. And it allowed for people also to say, I was born in this tradition, but I'm more drawn to that particular tradition. So not only is this true in the formulations and the disciplines, it's equally true in the perception of the divine. So for some, the aspect of the love of the divine and for the divine becomes stronger. And for someone else, the knowledge of the divine and the divine knowledge becomes stronger, or other aspects. So it was encouraged to subsist side by side, and each man was free to accept and follow that which was congenial to his thought, feeling, temperament, build of the nature. Now these four terms are very important. And each one of us has to now introspect, because the same principle applies when we follow the practice of the integral yoga. Not only is the integral yoga the same framework, allowing for broad aspects and variations across humanity, because remember, one of the characteristics, outstanding features of the integral yoga, to use Sri Aurobindo's phrase, is that it does not have a prerequisite to follow. Anybody can begin the integral yoga from where they are. And so it has necessarily to take into account all variations of human types and natures and stages of development. So such a formulation necessarily has to be broad and encompassing, wide and supple as the evolutionary method of nature. So what is congenial to your thought? Putting it in another way, when you think of the divine, how do you conceive of the divine most naturally? And sometimes it takes certain forms even. So some people will actually say, for me the divine is the divine mother. For somebody else it will be the divine as Vishnu, or I love that aspect of Shiva, when he's there bare above on the peaks of the snowy mountains and he looks down at the whole universe from his great wide freedom. Some aspect of the divine calls to, first, your thought, second, your feeling, third, your temperament. We will use the word swabhava as a broad term, more mental, more emotional, or more action-oriented, more introspective, more extrovert, more analytic, or more synthetic, or more artistic, or more argumentative, for example. Whatever your temperament, that's your starting point. You begin where you are. As you turn towards the divine, what is it in you that turns first? Or what of the divine that you perceive closest to you and most drawn to? And then there's this fourth word he uses, build of the nature. And this is very interesting because it looks at how we are formed and the particular character of this formation. It's going to something almost physical. So there are builds which are strong physical bodies. And the physical body and its strength therefore needs to engage in its relationship with the divine. There are other builds which are very light, fragile. And so it needs to relate to the divine from its fragility and not from its strong vitality or force or physical strength. When the mother assigned people in the ashram to work, she looked at all these. And of course, the inherent psychic aspiration. But the form of the work had to match the form of the person. And at that particular stage of your development, what was needed most? So I give an example, a few stories, some of which I may have narrated before. One is of a person who, we were told later, the mother had even described that he was a being who was almost asuric in temperament, tremendous vitality, tremendous force, and strong individuality, almost egoistic in its full power of ego, and tremendous physical energy and strength. Such a person she put to physical work. And the man was proud of how he was serving the mother. It was giving an opportunity for that, what would have otherwise turned into an asuric form, to turn to the divine and put to the service of the divine this enormous vitality and energy. And even through the ego says, I will serve the divine, I will work for the divine. And through that, it turns to the divine, and which is great. It's not something bad. If you have a strong ego, Sri Aurobindo explains, you have to start with the idea that you put yourself in service to the divine as with your ego. If your ego is not very strong, you can say, all right, I remove myself and follow what the divine wills. It's a different way of achieving the same thing finally. So he would actually take a ox cart, fully loaded, and pull it and drag it through the hot sun. He would walk. In those days, there was tar which was used in the soil. I remember still, the tar used to boil in the midday sun. You would see little bubbles form. He would walk barefoot all the way to the dining room and back to the ashram, proud of his strength and vitality. Another one whose body was much more frail, very thin. This man was huge. The other one was frail, but he had the same huge vitality, which again turned to the mother in service. And in his letters, in his correspondence, he documents how he would eat 40 puris. A puri is about this size, along with vegetables, 40 to 50, and still had the capacity to digest it and eat more. We've heard stories like this in the Mahabharata, of Bhim eating an entire cartload of vegetables and fruits. And we said, must be exaggeration. But here was a man who actually did that. He was capable of that. And mother used these. They were the builders for the ashram. She said she turned all these great vital beings to serving to build this new creation that she had. And the gods, Daivik or more Sattvic types, were weak. They had to follow in after. So one other person she used to build institutionally, and then she would pull him out and put someone else to run it. He would then build something else, she would pull him out, put someone else to run it. I give this as an example of how she knew how to work with the types, always turning them towards the divine. And another extreme was a professor who narrated this himself. He said he came from Orissa with the full pride of his knowledge and his professorship, and he was a brilliant professor in the knowledge he had, and he expected he would be put in the school to teach. And straight away mother sent him to work in the dining room to wipe vessels which had been washed, or to wash them. And it was the most physical, strenuous, and for him even menial job. Because for his poise, knowledge was above menial work. And he was suddenly doing the thing which he most detested. And it went on for a while. Eventually he went through this severe reactions and even thought he might leave because his greatness was not appreciated. And then one day he woke up to the fact of what was happening and said, my God, I'm here to serve the mother. Do I even have a right to oppose what she has given me? And this reversal took place where he said, all right, I will accept whatever mother gives me. She knows better. And the moment he completed this reversal, the message came from the mother, now you're assigned to teach in the school. You see, in her consciousness, she was aware of the state of each person. And she was pushing him towards this reversal, that this ego could break and yield to the divine will. And the moment that work was done, she was conscious of it because she was pushing it. I'm going to link it to this earlier discussion we had about the instinct in man, the work of the religious instinct in man. What is instinct but nature within us? What is nature but the lower working of the divine energy? In a layer which is almost mechanical, and Sri Aurobindo uses the word somnambulist, half sleeping, pushing, pulling, but half sleeping, not fully conscious of the divinity and the source of wisdom and power, which is the driving force and knowledge of nature. But we open ourselves to the Divine Mother, who is higher nature, divine nature. But it is she who works through the instinct within us even, isn't it? So equally, as we turn our instinct towards her, she fills the instinct with her knowledge, and her awakened knowledge and power works through that same impulse now revealed. And instinct turns more and more towards intuition, where the knowledge is more powerful than the will impulse. And she awakes in us and through us that very part that we have turned towards her, and uses that as the means for our awakening, and therefore speeding up nature's process by her direct action. And so this is the example of how she worked, one good example to understand how she worked in him, but this is how she was working with everybody. Maybe one more example of a certain type like this, in a person of whom a few people, where repeatedly they had physical breakdowns. The bodies would slip into ill health. In one case, a person had frequent diarrhea. And repeatedly you will find Sri Aurobindo's letters to him saying something like, you must put a will to get rid of this habit of your body. Now what was interesting was whenever he had a great spiritual turn and awakening, and a spiritual force would begin to grow in intensity in the working, there would be the breakdown of the body. And it's the habit of the body's inability to contain, and so it cannot hold, it spills it. And naturally it takes the physical form of the diarrhea, because that's the way the body moves to spill what it cannot contain. And I believe eventually he did overcome, but I do know for a fact that he was quite frail through much of his life. So all of this just shows you that while the underlying principles are universal, the particular form in which we have to articulate and work through them will vary, and will vary in your stages of journey. As the divine working in you grows to strengthen you and even awaken in your thoughts and in your feelings different parts which you didn't know existed, well, those now will become the leader of your journey. So very simply put, you start from where you are, opening yourself to the divine. What in you responds first? What of the divine do you feel closest? Start by joining these, and the rest grows. So he's described this particular character which you see in India, and he says, it is right and reasonable that there should be this plasticity proper to experimental evolution. Very interesting term he uses. This plasticity of working is necessary even for experimental evolution. What does that mean? You see, when nature is pushing evolution to develop something which has never been done before, she has to try out and see what works. And for this particular nature, will this work? Will that work? And she pushes, pulls, modifies, combines until she gets something working. And when it works, she begins to amplify that in all others of the same type. That's why you will find Mother repeatedly speaks of us as representatives of a human type or a human problem. And if within us something can be resolved, every body of that type receives the benefit of it. That's how nature works. When she pushes in a plant or in the instinct in an animal, when she pushes in one, if she succeeds in one, she brings that impulse of push in all others where that works. And in the variation where it doesn't work, she builds the variation now which will work, which then she includes in all the other variations. That's the reason why you'll see evolution always initially makes these fluctuating attempts followed by failures, or partial attempts, partial successes, until something is reasonably formed. It works. And suddenly, rapidly, all over the earth, it starts popping up in the manner that it's been found to work. And this will be true equally of the spiritual evolution. But it needs this. It is right and reasonable that there should be this plasticity proper to experimental evolution. Even, you will remember, Sri Aurobindo speaks about it in context of the ashram. The enormous freedom given, which is also largely misused in the beginning. The enormous freedom given is necessary because in the growth, you have to have the freedom to experiment, including the freedom to make mistakes. If at every point somebody says, no, that's dangerous, don't do, you will never widen and develop the full plasticity of possibilities of whatever particular tendency of consciousness or power of consciousness that you're developing. It must necessarily try out, bump into mistakes, find, correct them, work around them to develop the full play of its possibilities. And then there's a colon, and he now elaborates on this idea. For religion's real business is to prepare man's mind, life, and bodily existence for the spiritual consciousness to take it up. It has to lead him to that point where the inner spiritual light begins fully to emerge. It is at this point that religion must learn to subordinate itself. So you see the logic of this. In the first step, the first priority of religion is to prepare man's mind, life, and bodily existence for the spiritual consciousness to take it up. Once that begins to take it up, then religion has to now submit to that and follow what it asks, not what it wants. But in the beginning, it has to insist on what is needed to prepare for that. And so you see the importance of the discipline. What are we going to do for the discipline? Well, it's for each one of us to see. One of the forms in which the mother imposed that discipline in the ashram, always allowing for exceptions, of course, everybody must work. And sometimes it would be a number of hours. It is through the work that your physical consciousness and your most outer part of the personality is engaged and put in relation to the divine consciousness. Of course, the work is not menial work. It has to be done in consecration, put in relation to the divine, irrespective of what you do. Everything is important. I recently had this interaction with a group from a Buddhist monastery. They were describing the life there, the monastic life. And you'll see the similar idea of discipline imposed. Everybody in the beginning of the monastic life starts by cleaning the toilets. There's the story which comes in one of those traditions, Buddhist traditions. They say, what was this man doing before he was enlightened? He was cleaning the toilets. What did he do after he was enlightened? He continued cleaning the toilets. The point is not toilets. The point is that the value of the work is not in terms of its physical form, but in terms of the consciousness with which you do it. And your consciousness be more awakened or less awakened, it just changes the state of the relationship with the divine. It does not change the nature of need not change the nature of the work. Of course, it can change also if you find certain work forms more conducive to that relationship. Of course, it will change. But the point is, you can start with any work in principle or any form in principle. So they were describing all their disciplines. And you will see inevitably in any monastic order, in any religious community or even spiritual communities, the first level is often a kind of discipline. And the goal of that is to precisely this, prepare man's mind, life and bodily existence for the spiritual consciousness to take it up. So again, we can review what it is that we are doing from these three aspects. What are we doing to assist our mind to enter in relation with the spiritual consciousness and to make it more open for the mother to take it up and work in your mind? Have you done something during the day, every day, to make for this opening of your mind? And there can be many aspects. One aspect will be the mind dwelling on the idea of the divine and perhaps even perceiving the divine presence around you within everything. Or it may be making the mind more plastic, or maybe developing certain faculties and powers of the mind to make it more capable as a rich instrument for the divine to take up, but with that idea, with that intention. And you can do, for example, some reading or study of Sri Aurobindo's writings, or even any other writing, technical terms, technical writing. Learn a new language to make your mind more supple, to make it more capable, so that it may be a better instrument. So you have to see what works for you. Second, turn your life heart, life energy, life force, in whatever form it is, what in you feels most easily turning to the divine from there, or what would make you more receptive or more plastic to receive the divine influence in the life energies? Review and start doing something, if nothing else, even for 5 minutes. And the third would be bodily existence. And there, of course, Mother gave us an example of how she wanted the bodily existence to be prepared, or even the character to be prepared. And they are written in our school notebooks. She ensured that they were written there. And as children, you saw this text and it made no sense to you when you were very small. When you grew up, it became boring because you've been seeing it for so many years. And then many years later, when you've forgotten it and you remember it, suddenly it acquires a deep meaning. And I'll share with you one statement she makes. The children should be helped to grow up into straightforward, frank, upright, honorable human beings, ready to develop into divine nature. That's your program. Helped to develop into straightforward, frank, upright, honorable human beings. But for what goal? So that you're ready when the divine afflatus comes, or when you wake up to the realization that your life is meant for that divine awakening, well, everything is ready for that. And to the physical program that she gave, of course, similar things. She said the mind must be made an instrument for the divine knowledge, the vital body made an instrument for the divine power, the body made an instrument for the divine beauty, and the psychic being, the instrument for the divine love. And for that, there's a program which she mentions of how to make the body strong, supple, conscious. Again, with the idea that it is ready to develop into divine nature. And if you think about it in this way, review your day, review your life, whatever work you may be doing, what can you bring into that work which assists in this direction? And you have your starting point for a daily discipline. And that's your religion in that sense. So religion's real business is to prepare man's mind, life and bodily existence for the spiritual consciousness to take it up. It has to lead him to that point where the inner spiritual light begins fully to emerge. Now, obviously, this puts a very different priority. Everything you do must eventually, somehow or other, be put in relation to the inner spiritual light. Valued in terms of your inner spiritual light. Dedicated to serving the inner spiritual light. Mother gives a very simple exercise which she taught to the children to practice and to the sadhaks who were there. Most people today don't even know about it because we don't listen to those recordings of the mother's classes which were given weekly to all the children. Nobody today gets it, and it's there in some book now. It's a very simple exercise. She says, consider everything that you do in your life and put it in relation to your central aspiration. And view it from that perspective. And you notice very quickly that certain things are in alignment with the central aspiration, other things are not so much in alignment. Certain things help for that aspiration to grow, and other things tend to cloud it or cover it. Just observe. And just that will begin a corrective process. And she says, bit by bit, you'll find things will begin to rearrange. And if you can, consciously bring those things which nourish your aspiration closer. Bring those things which are less helpful farther from the center of your priority in life. Even if you don't do it consciously, it will happen by the very fact that you're aware of it. And this prepares you for this. But think of it on all three levels: mind, life, even body. You may do basic physical exercises, for example, for the body. But you can do it to get good health. You can do it to make your body attractive. But you can do it to make your body conscious of the divine presence and even feel the divine presence in the body. And even feel the aspiration in the body and in its movements, in its actions. And it doesn't matter which exercise you do, you can do it with this intention. And when you start doing it like that, automatically, because everything of your outer three layers are putting as reference the central psychic influence, that now begins to fill. It was always there. It was waiting for you to wake up and turn and invite it. And now that begins to fill because you're calling it. And so it has to lead him to that point where the inner spiritual light begins fully to emerge. It is at this point that religion must learn to subordinate itself, not to insist on its outer characters, but give full scope to the inner spirit itself to develop its own truth and reality. So now what will happen as this influence grows, certain practices, forms and disciplines you have, all useful, may feel it themselves coming in collision, or something feels uncomfortable, and you allow the deeper influence to reshape, form, maybe drop, maybe awaken new forms, new disciplines, new relationships with the divine, and it will lead more and more. But you don't give up everything suddenly. You allow it to shape the form of your life. And maybe you go through transitions in life also in which the shape changes. What happens often with people who take very strong pursuit of discipline with a strong will is that they get stuck with the form of the practice. Since I was 20 years old, every day I have done this for half an hour. The pride of that prevents you from recognizing that it has served its purpose and now you need to move on. Let go of that form which is now wasting your half an hour basically. I had a friend who I found to be always sleep deprived. And I asked him what's happening. And he said to me he wakes up very early and he would spend 2.5 to 3 hours of doing various recitations of this sacred text, that sacred text, repeating the name of whatever so many times. It lasted 3.5 hours. But that, he said, I need that to be able to get myself into that state where I feel the spiritual presence. So a few years down, again, we met and I said, how long do you still do that? He said, yes. I said, how long does it take you to feel that? Oh, I feel that within the first half an hour or 1 hour. I said, okay, then do you think you can reduce the time that you're spending? I can't say stop it. So reduce it so that you're not so much sleep deprived. And at least your physical health can catch up, even your mind. But he did reduce, but he couldn't let go of the thing itself. Not recognizing that it's not how many times he repeats, but the depth of love and devotion with which you open and give yourself, which makes immediately for that contact. In the very nature of the practice, you're busy counting. Have I reached my 100 or 1,000 yet? And so the attention is more on the counting than on the love for the divine. And if you were to open yourself in love with the divine, maybe you achieve it in the very first step rather than having to go through so many. So somewhere always you will begin with something, allow the form of practice to change, led by the deeper experience. And the reference is only this: what brings you closer to the divine presence, to touch and near to its core, bit by bit, always, in these three parts. So it is at this point that religion must learn to subordinate itself. Now, looking at the overall perspective of human evolution, we recognize that religion had its role when it had to dominate and insist on forms. But it has to give way when that thing begins to emerge. And as that thing emerges, religions begin to be felt more and more like external crusts. And even if you do nothing, eventually they'll break down. This is what you're seeing everywhere in the world. Increasingly, you will find all over the world, among the young, there is this category that they call non-religious, but spiritual. What that means varies for each one of them. But it means already something inside them they feel and that they're trying to follow or they're trying to find. But something is being felt already. This we could not do 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago even, because humanity was not yet ready on a large scale. Of course, there were always small patches, small groups. But on this kind of scale, it's happening today. And it's happening for two reasons. One, because there is an overall maturity in the human evolution that we are ready for it. But there is equally on the other side the descending action of the supramental force. If that had not been there, this emergent awakening would not be so strong. And this was one of the most critical aspects of the work of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. It is the act of bringing that down and establishing it as a living power, active power in evolution, which has saved human evolution literally. Otherwise, it could have easily slipped out into a most dangerous direction, as has happened in the past, as has happened in so many other evolutionary turns on other planets. It is this action now active in us, even when we are not conscious of it. It is constantly pushing, nudging. Mother was asked, what is the supramental force doing? She said, working to hasten the divine manifestation as rapidly as possible, as smoothly as possible, without the sharp break of a destructive passage. And this is what we have to appreciate, and was the central part of their work. It means also for us, if we can become conscious of its presence, maybe you don't feel the supramental consciousness in its infinity and its totality, because we are unable to feel that, but we can feel it in its influence. And its influence as a light of intuition, as a touch of the Divine Mother's presence, maybe in our heart, guiding, nudging, showing the way, lighting up, discriminating, showing where there's a mixture, and open ourselves more and more, recognizing that what we're touching is, like, say, the tail end or the tip of the supramental influence and action. So, to give full scope to the inner spirit itself to develop its own truth and reality. In the meanwhile, so while this is happening, what do we do? In the meanwhile, it has to take up as much of man's mentality, vitality, physicality as it can, and give all his activities a turn towards the spiritual direction, the revelation of a spiritual meaning in them, the imprint of a spiritual refinement, the beginning of a spiritual character. So there are 4 aspects of this work, what religion has to do. Now, we may discard the word religion because now it's no more fashionable. Rather, it's fashionable to be irreligious. Okay, so discard that word, but recognize the discipline which is given by your tradition, by your environment, by your lineage, by your elders, by whoever you respect, who for you represents or assists in your spiritual development. So what does it have to do meanwhile until this inner presence leads? And we'll end with this. It has to take up as much of man's mentality, vitality, physicality as it can. It can't take up all of it. Not all of your mind, not all of your heart, not all of your body is even ready to enter in relation with the spiritual. There are large parts which may say, boring, not interesting, or even rebel. But there are parts in you which seek, which value. Start with that. But in all 3. And then give all his activities, that means everything you do in your life, from morning through evening through night, including your sleep, give all his activities a turn towards the spiritual direction. That's the first thing. What does that mean? You eat food, you'll find out there's a prayer that the Mother has given. In fact, there are 2 prayers where she describes invoking the divine presence into the food before you eat it. The same thing you do, you first make a consecration, offering, invoking the presence, with the idea that with this food, her presence goes into you and spreads into all the cells and awakens in them her consciousness and the aspiration for her. You are going to clear your bowels? Well, with it, let all the past, let all that is contradictory to the divine be purged from my consciousness and be freed. You take a shower, there's a prayer traditionally in India where we invoke the 7 rivers to purify our whole being, not just the body, mind, life force, and physical body, cleaning all 3, removing from it all the stale past and the impurities. You're going to sleep. What does sleep mean? It's a trance of immersion in the night of the divine. That is, inward, not extroverted, introverted in immersion, where you forget the world, but you lose yourself in the core of the world, in the heart of the world. So, aligned with this turn towards spiritual direction is the second thing, the revelation of a spiritual meaning in them. You get the spiritual direction because there is a meaning already. Everything in the universe represents some aspect of the divine, is the divine in a special aspect. And this includes every activity that you may do. You have in the bhakti traditions in India very interesting stories. There is the potter who goes around knocking people's heads like a pot and says, this one is still raw. This one is well baked. He's ready. He's mature. You take the symbol of the potter and it has a meaning. You take the butcher and it has the meaning. You take the man who pours water, who gives water, it has a different meaning. Anything you do has a symbol, deep symbolism within it, and you as if awaken to that and make that your means of a link. And if you are doing paperwork in an office where you have to put together things with precision, well, you're assembling different aspects of the divine to bring out of them something more beautiful, more harmonious, more true. It does not matter what you do. So the first thing is, take up all of these activities, turn towards the spiritual direction. And second, as this grows, you begin to feel, to perceive the truth behind the revelation of a spiritual meaning in them and in everything you do. Third, with that comes the third stage, the imprint of a spiritual refinement. As this sense of the meaning grows, everything is refined. So the food we eat, for example, we don't eat like the dogs or the animals. How do they eat? Watch them eat. And if you did that, you would be called a barbarian. What do we eat? We mentalize everything. We refine in mental terms. Make it beautiful, make it colorful, make it nutritious, arrange it, create wonderful flavors, turning into mind's values. But the same can be done into spiritual values. And that's a whole different dimension, but that comes when you perceive the divine presence sacred within it. And now as I eat, as I drink, it has a spiritual value, a spiritual symbol, and with it a refinement which is spiritual. Every activity of life can become refined spiritually, and when all the activities of your life become more and more refined, starting with whatever can be, and we don't have to do everything in the beginning. As it becomes more and more refined, what happens next? This refinement now becomes your norm, your normal status, your character. So the fourth facet is the beginning of a spiritual character. And at that point, religion has served its purpose. The discipline has served its purpose. You have a character which is now inherently spiritual, which makes it ready now for the divinization. It is in trying to do this, to refine and bring into a spiritual character, that we have the problems of religion, which he discusses in the next paragraph, because the very process involves taking material which is coarse to be refined. And so it introduces distortions in the very attempt. And we will study that next Sunday. But review this paragraph, the half paragraph that we have done. Replace the word religion because we don't like that word. It's not fashionable. Call it spiritual culturing. Call it spiritual discipline. Call it spiritual refinement, or spiritualizing all the activities of your life. And consider what can change. And give small nudges to each of these. And in this we will have put to best use this first line of nature's development to awaken us to the divine reality. Later, in another couple of paragraphs, we will look at the other three also. And that will complete the full development of our whole being in its spiritual turn. So we'll pause here and perhaps meditate upon it for half a minute.